Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we dive into this frozen world of fjords and firelight, take just a moment, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It helps so much more than you might think. Also, I'm always curious, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it on your end? Midnight? 2 in the morning? Maybe even later? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all tuning in. Alright, go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe pull up the blankets a little tighter. Close your eyes if you want. This is a long one, and it's cold. Let's talk about how the Vikings survived the longest, darkest, most brutal nights of winter and didn't die. They called it Fimbulvetr, the Great Winter. Not just a cold season, but a mythic one. A time when the snow never stopped falling, the sun never rose, and the wolves of night seemed to edge closer to the firelight with every breath. In our modern world, we romanticize Viking life as all axes and longboats, but survival was never guaranteed. Winters in Scandinavia were long, dark, and unforgiving. Temperatures dropped low enough to freeze breath mid-air. Winds off the fjords howled like beasts. The forests became ghostlands. And yet, they endured. Not with brute strength alone, but with knowledge passed down like fire from one hand to another. First, they built their home longhouses. These were not just shelters, they were the heart of survival. Long, narrow, and low. Built with overlapping planks of wood called stave, and covered with turf or thatch for insulation. The inside was one large room, shared by people and animals alike. Chickens, goats, even oxen slept alongside families not just for protection, but for warmth. The body heat of livestock was part of the system. The hearth burned constantly, its smoke curling into the rafters, darkening the beams until they glistened with soot. Ventilation was minimal enough to avoid suffocation, but not enough to lose precious warmth. They slept wrapped in layers of wool, under blankets made from sheepskin or fur, pressed together for body heat. And they didn't sleep the way we do it, uninterrupted hours. Instead, they followed segmented sleep. First sleep began after sunset and lasted a few hours. Then came a waking period used for quiet tasks, prayer, even storytelling, followed by second sleep until dawn. It was natural, rhythmic, calming. And fact 1. The Vikings used moss, yes, moss, as insulation in their clothing and boots. Not only did it help trap heat, but moss also had antibacterial properties, which made it ideal for stuffing into wounds too. A humble plantain, unsung hero of survival. Second fact, their winter diets were carefully planned. In the cold, bodies burn more calories just to stay warm. So they relied on preserved meats, dried fish like stockfish, smoked lamb, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots. They made hearty stews thick with barley and grains. They fermented dairy like skirto extend its life. And in the leanest months, they turned to blood porridge, made from animal blood, flour, and fat. Not appetizing to us, maybe, but rich in iron and warmth. Third fact, Viking winter gear was surprisingly advanced. They wore layered tunics of wool, outer coats called varfeldir, made from shaggy sheepskin, and leather boots insulated with straw or hay. Their mittens were 2-layer done inside out to create a pocket of air between layers for extra warmth. Their cloaks fastened with brooches weren't just fashion. They were survival tools worn across one shoulder, allowing sword arms to stay free while trapping warmth inside. But gear alone wasn't enough. The cold seeped in. It always did. So they turned to each other. Community mattered. Isolation killed. In longhouses, families gathered for warmth, shared stories and songs to pass the time. Skald's Viking poets recited sagas, not just to entertain, but to preserve memory, to remind everyone that suffering had been endured before and survived. One tale told of Thor's journey to Jotunheim, where the frost giants lived. There, even the thunder god felt the cold bite, but he outwitted them not with brute strength, but by drinking from a horn that secretly drained the sea. A metaphor, perhaps, for enduring what cannot be conquered? They believed in warmth beyond fire ritual warmth, spiritual warmth. Yule was celebrated deep in winter, long before it was Christianized. They lit bonfires, decorated with runes, slaughtered animals in offering, and feasted in honor of returning light. The darkest night was also the most sacred, and when it passed, they marked it, a turning point, a promise, and so they waited, slept, prayed, huddled, endured. Tomorrow we'll dive deeper into how they used animals, how they managed illness, what they dreamed during those endless nights. But for now, just rest. Imagine the fire crackling low, the wind rattling the thatch above. You are wrapped in fur, surrounded by family, and the cold cannot touch you tonight. You have survived one more night, just like they did, just like you always will. Sleep now and dream of snow. Under the weight of endless snow and darkness, the Vikings adapted in ways that seem almost mythical to us now, but they were grounded in practicality, ingenuity, and sheer will. As the nights grew longer and the world outside froze into stillness, the inside of a Viking longhouse transformed into its own ecosystem of survival. Let's talk more about what happened after the fire burned low and the stories were told, because even then, they weren't idle. One of the most fascinating practices was textile work done during winter months, spinning wool, weaving cloth, mending garments. These were not just chores, they were acts of preservation. A well-repaired cloak could mean the difference between surviving a journey and freezing mid-step. Looms were set up inside the longhouse, and by the glow of the hearth and small oil lamps, women and sometimes even men worked with spindle and shuttle, their fingers calloused but careful. Fact 1. The Vikings made their own candles from animal phthalate pine resin. They dipped twisted linen into the fat to make wicks, and those small flames provided precious light when the world outside seemed devoured by night. These tallow candles burned smoky and quick, but even a few minutes of light made the darkness feel less eternal. Second fact. Viking children were taught survival skills from a very young age. By the age of 6 or 7, boys knew how to hunt small game, fish through ice, and start a fire using flint and steel. Girls learned to tend the hearth, preserve meat, and spin wool. There was no time for prolonged childhood. Winter demanded competence, and every pair of hands mattered. Third fact. During the coldest months, Vikings practiced something akin to hibernation, not in the animal sense, but they conserved energy dramatically. They limited movement, bundled in layers, and often slept in longer intervals. The human body, under prolonged cold, shifts metabolism. The Vikings understood this instinctively. They embraced slowness. Days were marked not by hours, but by meals, by shifts in the wind, by the crackle of frost on wooden beams. Inside, the rhythm of life became internal. Evenings were filled with storytelling. Skalds recited ancient sagacism lasting hours, even days. These were not just myths, they were oral libraries. A skald might recount the tale of Egil Skallagrimson, who defied death by composing poetry so powerful it stopped a king's wrath. Or of Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, who fought with axe in hand when enemies stormed her camp. These stories were fuel not just for the imagination, but for identity. To remember was to endure, and they remembered everything. The names of ancestors, the histories of clans, the old gods. Speaking of gods, their beliefs shaped how they endured winter. They didn't fear the dark as absence, they saw it as presence. The long nights were filled with spirits. Odin wandered in disguise, seeking wisdom. The wild hunt thundered through the ski-spectral riders chasing souls. The dead walked on certain nights, and offerings of bread and ale were left outside to appease them. Winter was a threshold, a season between worlds, and yet there was comfort in ritual. The changing of runestones, the offering of pine and evergreen to represent life that persisted through death. They carved runes into bone and wood, charms for protection. Some tied bells above doorways to ward off dark spirits. Superstition? Maybe. but it gave shape to fear. Fact 4. The Vikings brewed a special winter ale called Julel for Yule, flavored with herbs like juniper and yarrow. It wasn't just about drinking, it was about tradition, memory, and honoring ancestors. This beer was stronger than usual and served warm, sometimes thickened with honey. A drink of resilience. Fifth fact. To prevent illness, Vikings used steam bathsprotos saunas called sweat lodges. Inside small structures heated by stones, they poured water over the rocks to create steam, then whipped their bodies with birch branches to stimulate circulation. Afterward, they would plunge into icy water or snow, not just for health, but for purification. And sixth fact. Their snowshoes were crafted from bent wood and woven animal sinew, allowing them to glide over deep snow while hunting or traveling. They also used sleds pulled by dogs or ponies, wrapped in fur and canvas to protect goods. The outside world may have been lethal, but they didn't let it trap them. They moved carefully, deliberately, and when storms raged, they stayed still, because survival wasn't always about fighting the cold. Sometimes it was about yielding to it, respecting it, waiting it out. Inside the longhouse, the cold scratched at the doors, howled through cracks in the roof. The people sat close. They passed carved combs from hand to hand, cleaned hair, and shared lice jokes because, even in survival, there was humor. There had to be. Laughter was a kind of heat. As night deepened, the fire was fed again. Embers glowed red. Shadows danced. And still they endured. Through stories. Through rituals. Through stillness. They survived not because they were fearless, but because they prepared, adapted, believed. And in the heart of every long, dark Viking night, there was light, just enough, always enough. Sleep now. Let your breath slow. The storm outside is not for you tonight. You are warm. You are safe. You are here. There's something about silence in winter that feels deeper than silence at any other time. It's not just the absence of sound, it's a presence of stillness. The kind that settles into your bones. The Vikings knew this well. As the wind scraped against wooden walls and the snow muffled every footstep, they adjusted not only how they moved, but how they thought. Because survival in such cold wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, even spiritual. Let's go deeper. Fact 7. Viking longhouses were engineered with surprising sophistication. Though made mostly from wood, stone, and turf, the roofs were layered thick, with sod-living grass to provide insulation. Some homes had trenches beneath the floor, where hot stones were placed to radiate heat upward. It wasn't central heating, but it was clever. Warmth wasn't wasted. Every ember mattered. And sleeping arrangements weren't just cozy, they were calculated. Families slept shoulder to shoulder under shared woolen blankets, creating a cocoon of shared body heat. This proximity wasn't just for warmth, it reinforced kinship, trust, and cooperation. When you're inches from someone all night, you learn patience, awareness, care. Fact 8. Vikings used animal intestines as primitive windows. That's right. They stretched the thin membranes across small openings to let in pale light while keeping out wind and snow. These translucent window panes were surprisingly effective. On days when the sky was overcast and the sun a memory, even that faint glow made a difference. Fact 9. Viking warriors would often bury their weapons in the snow for purification. They believed winter could cleanse not only the blade but the spirit of its wielder. Before a battle or ritual, the blade was retrieved, kissed by frost, and symbolically reborn. This act was especially common before spring raids or after conflict, when a man had to reconcile what he'd done with who he wished to be. Winter was a season of reckoning. And while much of Viking life was practical, they were deeply poetic in how they saw the world. For example, they believed in hugger, a concept not easily translated, but roughly meaning the soul, mind, or inner energy of a person. During the winter, people said the hugger could grow sluggish or misaligned, leading to melancholy or dreams of distant places. To realign it, they sang. They told old tales. They sat in firelight and listened to rhythms older than language. The long, dark months became a mirror. You didn't just wait for the sun, you met yourself in the dark. Now, let's return to their food. We mentioned preservation, but not how it shaped community. Large cuts of meat were dried or salted, hung above the fire where smoke curled around them for weeks. Fish were strung like garlands, slowly hardening into stockfish. These foods weren't tasty by modern standards, but they lasted. And more importantly, they were shared. It was common to prepare communal feasts during Yule, not extravagant, but symbolic. Everyone brought what they had. Hospitality was secretive in famine. Fact 10. The Vikings believed that refusing a hungry traveler, especially in winter, could bring bad luck, or worse, spiritual retribution. They told tales of Odin walking the earth in disguise, testing the hearts of men. If you denied shelter to a stranger, you might be denying it to a god. Fact 11. Woolen snow hoods, or kufl, were used by Vikings as part of their cold weather wardrobe. These hoods covered the neck, shoulders, and upper chest, acting like a built-in scarf. Fact 12. The Vikings sometimes used animal bladders as water storage inside their cloaks. These small, soft flasks kept water from freezing completely if tucked close to the body. A man on a journey could sip warmth from beneath his tunic without having to stop. Smart, subtle, effective. Inside the home, children were taught not just chores, but songs. They sang about the seasons, the gods, the sea. These weren't lullabies, they were memory tools. Verses helped recall when to plant, when to butcher, which herbs could ease fever. Their education was oral, rhythmic, and continuous. A Viking child might not read or write, but by the age of 10, they could recite generations of ancestry, list every bone in a sheep, and tell you exactly when the stars would shift. And if they couldn't, they listened. Listening was survival too. And that, maybe, is the quiet secret of how they survived the coldest nights. Not with brute force, not with defiance, but with softness, with attention, with the kind of listening that waits through storms and sings anyway. Outside, the snow still falls, but in here, in the circle of flame and breath and voice, the world remains alive. Settle deeper. There's more to tell. Some say the cold teaches you what matters. Not in dramatic ways, but slowly, hour by hour, breath by breath. The Vikings, more than most, understood that cold wasn't something to conquer, it was something to respect. They didn't try to fight the winter, they adapted. They made it part of their rhythm, their identity, their legacy. Let's begin with fact 13. Vikings didn't always rely on firewood. In regions where trees were sparse, they burned dried animal dung mixed with moss. These fuel bricks burned hot and slow and were surprisingly odorless once dried. Gathering them was a community task, and their use was essential, especially during long, treeless winters on Iceland or Greenland. Fact 14. Vikings insulated their shoes with straw. Not thick fur or wool, but simple twisted straw stuffed between layers of leather. It wickeded moisture, trapped heat, and could be easily replaced when damp. This technique, called Vararfeldir, was cheap, effective, and still used in traditional Nordic gear today. Fact 15. Viking cloaks were not symmetrical. They were often cut longer on one side to be thrown over the shield arm, providing protection from wind, rain, and snow while allowing free movement on the sword side. It wasn't fashion, it was design born of battle and survival. But not everything about winter was hardship. There was a strange beauty in the stillness. The frost on the thatch roof glittered like starlight. Icicles formed from breath near doorways. The rhythm of life slowed. People spoke less, listened more. In these moments, the oral tradition flourished. Elders told stories by firelight, their voices low and unhurried. Tales of gods, yes, but also of winter beasts, spirits of frost and shadow. The Fjalknur, mountain women who lured wanderers into snowdrifts. The Draugr, undead souls who hated warmth and stalked lonely trails. These weren't bedtime stories, they were survival guides. How to read tracks. When to trust silence. What shapes in the dark meant danger. In these stories, cold wasn't just weather, it was character. It was the antagonist of every tale, and yet, also the teacher. Fact 16. Vikings brewed a special winter ale spiced with herbs like juniper, yarrow, and sweet gale. It was mildly alcoholic, deeply warming, and brewed during Yule celebrations. This beverage wasn't just for fun, it was symbolic of endurance, of transformation. Grains left in storage were turned into warmth. Time became flavor. Fact 17. Snow blindness was a known danger, especially on sea ice or during sunlit days after snowfall. To combat this, Vikings used primitive snow goggle slits carved into bone or wood to limit sunlight exposure. These devices reduced glare and preserved vision, showing just how ingeniously they learned from nature. Fact 18. Viking homes had a central hearth, but no chimney. Smoke gathered in the roof space and slowly leaked through thatched gaps. While smoky, this design had a hidden benefit. It discouraged insects from nesting in the rafters, and lightly smoked meats stored up high. A side effect became an advantage, like much of Viking life. Now imagine a typical night in January. Outside, the wind howls across frozen fjords. Inside, families gather on raised wooden platforms covered with animal hides. The hearth crackles, a low hum of voices fills the space. Children drift to sleep, not from comfort, but from exhaustion, wrapped in thick wool, their cheeks pink from the day's frost. The family dog lies curled near the fire. A mother weaves, fingers stiff but practiced. A father checks the roofline, listening for snowslide. It is simple, but not easy, and it is sacred. In the darkest months, they preserved not just food, but each other. They preserved memory, pride, ritual. Warmth became an act of will, of love, of patience. And while outside the world slept beneath a white hush, inside they endured. Not with roaring declarations, but with quiet, stubborn flame. And that is how the Vikings made it to spring. Not by outmuscling the winter, but by making peace with it. Every ember a prayer, every breath a promise. And every night survived, a story worth telling. As the nights grew longer and the sun slipped lower across the horizon, the Vikings entered a different kind of time. Not just winter, but something deeper. A stretch of months where the world narrowed. The sky dimmed earlier, the sea became steel, and the cold wasn't a season anymore, it was a constant presence. It shaped thought, pace, even memory. Inside the longhouse, shadows grew familiar. The same beam creaked each morning. The same frost formed on the same nail. Time passed not by calendars, but by how long the stew took to thaw. It's here that we encounter fact 19. Vikings used layered woolen undergarments that were often coated in lanolin, a natural oil found in sheep's wool. This made their clothes not only warm, but somewhat water-resistant. It wasn't armor, it was insulation. Hand-woven, hand-oiled, hand-patched. These garments mattered more than weapons during winter. Fact 20. Vikings didn't sleep through the night in one solid block. Instead, they practiced segmented sleep. 2 phases, broken by a waking period in the middle of the night. This wasn't seen as insomnia, but as normal. That quiet wakefulness was often used for prayer, sex, tending the fire, or storytelling. The cold didn't interrupt sleep, it shaped it, made it cyclical, mindful, shared. And fact 21. Many Viking longhouses were built slightly into the ground not just for insulation, but to shield from the wind. These sunken homes, called pit houses or semi-subterranean dwellings, created microclimates where heat stayed trapped. They were dark, close, but they were safe. Warmth in winter didn't come from comfort, it came from cleverness. It's easy to romanticize now the glow of firelight, the flicker of amber on carved beams, the slow rhythm of spinning wool. But the truth was more difficult. Winter was hunger, boredom, aching hands. It was managing smoke, rationing fat, scrubbing frostbite, melting snow to drink. A fire wasn't just light, it was life, and someone always had to watch it. That duty rotated, passed between children old enough to stay awake and elders too brittle to sleep soundly. It wasn't always spoken, just expected. Another way to survive together, but the cold, in all its cruelty, also clarified things. It made priorities sharp. In the frost, people remembered names, old debts, grudges, but they also remembered songs, rituals, promises. A wedding in summer might be simple, but a birth in midwinter that was a miracle. The community would gather. Gifts were brought: warm cloth, goat's milk, a carved token. The child would be rubbed with ash and snow to test its will, to welcome it into a world where nothing was given freely, even being alive. Fact 22. The Vikings believed in Nis, or top house spirits that guarded farms and homes, especially during Yule. To keep them happy, bowls of porridge were left out on winter nights. If you forgot, misfortune followed: broken tools, spoiled food, or animals disappearing. Whether real or ritual, these customs anchored people in the season. Fact 23. Animal fat was used not just for food but for heat and light. Long-burning tallow candles were made from rendered fat, often mixed with bits of herbs to reduce odor. These candles smoked, sputtered, and guttered in wind, but they were better than darkness. In deep winter, you didn't waste anything that could burn. And fact 24. Some Vikings slept with heated stones wrapped in cloth, placed under beds of straw. These heat stones were warmed in the hearth and transferred to bedding to ward off frost. Not luxurious, but effective. When snow piled against the doors and the moon cast sharp white light across the fields, the nights stretched wider. It wasn't unusual for people to go days without stepping outside. Not out of laziness, but preservation. Even going to the outhouse became strategic. Paths were shoveled, straw was scattered, and people moved quickly, then returned to the core, to the hearth, to the shared warmth of others. And so life contracted inward, hearts beat closer. The sound of another person breathing nearby became comforting. Proof you weren't alone, that you were surviving, that the night had passed and you were still here. The wind in the north was not merely cold, it was memory. It scraped across the land like a blade, shaping hills, scarring trees, and pushing breath back into the lungs of those who dared walk against it. For the Vikings, this wind was not an enemy. It was a teacher. It taught patience, endurance, silence. It blew through the cracks of their wooden homes, carrying the scent of distant pine, the whisper of snow, the howl of wolves that never came close but always reminded you they were there. As the night deepened, frost crept inside like a quiet visitor, spreading across the walls like lace, curling around iron tools, freezing water in bowls left too close to the door. The hearth became the center of everything. Not a luxury, not a symbol, but the absolute heartbeat of life. It burned low and long, fed with care. Children were taught to tend to it before they learned to fish. The old stirred the embers with practiced fingers, knowing that too much wood would suffocate the flame and too little would surrender to the cold. Around the hearth they would sit, not in noisy gatherings, but in soft, slow rhythms. The crackling wood spoke more than the people did. Long winters bred quiet wisdom. A glance could replace a sentence. A sigh could hold a story. People passed the time not by hours, but by tasks: mending a tear in a cloak, sharpening a knife, boiling herbs, stirring dried berries into thick porridge. Every action meant survival. The light from the fire didn't reach far. Most of the longhouse remained in shadows, shapes barely visible beyond the ring of orange. But that darkness was familiar. It wasn't frightening. It was restful, protective. Outside, the snow muffled the world. You could walk 20 steps from the house and feel like you were the last person alive. The stars above were cold, distant, but constant. They shimmered over frozen fjords and mountains black as iron. The northern lights would sometimes dance, green and blue and violet, silent and powerful. And people would watch them from the narrow slits of their homes, children pressing their noses to the wood, eyes wide. Inside, time slowed. There was no rush. Stories unfolded in their own time, shaped by the rhythm of the teller's breath and the flicker of the flame. Legends of gods, of sea monsters, of ancestors whose bones lay beneath the snow just beyond the walls. Names whispered like spells. Sigurd, Freya, Njord. They weren't just stories, they were reminders, markers of what had been endured before, proof that others had seen winters even darker, even colder and still survived. Food was never wasted. Bones were boiled 3 times. Bread was dry to last for months. Meat hung high in the rafters, curing slowly, absorbing the smoke. Even children learned to scrape fat from skins, to turn broth cloudy with marrow, to count root vegetables like coins. The cold demanded discipline. It punished forgetfulness. A missing glove could cost fingers. A cracked window could ruin a month's worth of effort. People checked everything twice, then again. When someone did step outside, they were never alone. You moved as a pair. You left markings in the snow. You carried more than you thought you needed. Because winter didn't care if you had good intentions. It cared only that you were prepared. And when one did not return, when a hunter or traveler vanished into the white, the community did not shout or panic. They lit another fire, kept the seat warm, waited. If they came back, they were welcomed with silence and soup. If they did not, their name was added to the stories, not with fear, but reverence. They became part of the long night, the sleep of the earth. It was understood. Life and death shared the same roof. In spring, the thaw would come. The ice would crack. The world would smell of mud and green. But in winter, everything paused. Every breath became precious. Every hand held warm. And in that quiet, the Vikings endured not by brute strength, but by knowing how to listen. To the fire, to the wind, to each other. There were nights in the Viking lands when even the strongest hearth could not keep out the deep cold. It wasn't just a lack of warmth, it was something older, something that moved beneath the floorboards and through the bones. The kind of cold that made the skin tighten around the eyes and the breath hang heavy and still. Those nights were different. Even the animals knew it. Dogs curled tighter. Horses pressed together in silence, breath steaming in the dark. People would sleep in shifts, not to guard against enemies, but to guard the fire. The youngest would sit closest, wrapped in every fur they owned, eyes half closed but always watching the coals. If the fire faltered, so did the pulse of the house. That flame, no bigger than a fist, held back a world that would freeze you in minutes. Food changed on those nights. It wasn't about flavor, it was about weight, about fat, about how long it would sit in your belly and burn slowly like a second fire. They would chew dried fish until it softened, sip hot broth with chunks of lard, pass down horn mugs filled with thick mead that felt like warmth itself. Laughter was rare on those nights, not because people were afraid, but because they were listening. The ice outside had a sound. It cracked and echoed. Trees groaned under snow. Sometimes there would be a sudden silence, so complete it felt like the sky had forgotten to breathe. And then the wind would return, rushing like a wave through the forest, rattling the walls, making the thatched roof whisper like it held secrets. Elders would close their eyes and nod. They'd heard it before. They would say it was Skadi, the goddess of winter, walking across the land. She wasn't cruel, she was just thorough. Everything touched by her steps turned still. In some homes, people hung carved symbols over their doorways, runes etched into wood or stone, passed down through families. Protection, endurance, return. Not magic, not superstition, just tradition. A way of marking the space as watched, remembered, not forgotten by the ancestors. When someone grew ill in the cold, care became ritual, blankets warmed by stones placed in the fire, herbs boiled until their smell filled the room. Songs sung softly to hold the soul close to the body. The line between life and death was thinner in the cold. Everyone knew it. No one said it aloud. Children were taught early never walk the woods alone. Never stray from the path. Never ignore the way frost forms on the inside of a window. It meant the cold had found its way in. And once it found a way, it would try to stay. Even tools reflected the season. Metal grew brittle if not cared for. Leather straps cracked. Everything needed tending. Hands were never idle. To sit and do nothing was to invite the chill to take root in you. So they worked, quietly, together, One mended nets. Another patched a hole in a boot. Someone twisted cord. Someone else scraped hide. They moved like a machine built of generations each part, knowing what to do without being told. And through it all, stories kept flowing. Not always spoken. Sometimes just a look, a gesture, a child handing an elder a bowl without being asked. The understanding that survival was not individual, it was communal. Even the weakest were never left behind. They were placed closest to the fire. They were fed first. Because the cold didn't just test the body, it tested the soul. And the Vikings knew that if they let it turn them cruel, they had already lost. So they stayed kind, quiet, determined. And somehow, when the sun finally returned, they would step outside, blinking, into a world that had survived with them. The return of light in Viking lands was not sudden. It didn't arrive with trumpets or golden beams. It crept back slowly, like a forgotten memory warming in the corners of the mind. The sun lingered longer on the horizon. The snow softened, just enough for water to begin its secret trickle beneath the drifts. And people noticed. Not with celebration, but with a quiet shifting of routines. Wood that had been hoarded through the worst nights was now burned a little more freely. Doors were opened for minutes at a time, letting in air that no longer bit the lungs. Children stepped outside and watched as icicles thinned and broke, their drops hitting the frozen ground like tiny drums. This part of the season was not yet spring, but it was no longer winter's peak. It was something in between, and that in between was sacred. It was a time of repair, not just of buildings or tools, but of bodies, of spirits. Skin cracked from wind was soothed with animal fat. Muscles that had stiffened in the cold were stretched and tested again. People sat together more. They spoke again, not just in function, but in rhythm. Songs returned. Not loud, not grand. Simple refrains hummed as hands worked. Songs of rowing, of weaving, of planting seeds that could not yet touch the soil but soon would. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were stewards. Of time, of land, of each other. With the easing of cold came the time for checking what had survived. The stores of grain, the barrels of salted fish, the bundles of herbs tied and dried before the snow. It was never just about what was left, it was about what could be made from it. Stews became richer. Bread was baked more often. Even a bit of honey might be shared if the hive had been generous before the freeze. And still, the cold waited. It had not truly gone. It lingered in the mornings, in the wind that curled around the corners of buildings. So fires were kept going, not blazing but steady. The hearth remained the heart of the home, and around it, stories deepened. This was the time for remembering the ones who hadn't made it. A brother lost on the ice. A grandmother who had gone to sleep and not woken. Their names were not mourned with wailing. They were spoken softly, added to the thread of family that wove through every hand, every voice. The children listened. They learned not just the names, but the weight they carried. This is what kept people whole: memory, kindness, continuity. Even when the world seemed to pause beneath a frozen sky. Out on the water, the ice began to crack in wider patterns. Boats that had been pulled far from shore were checked for damage. Nets were untangled. Harpoons sharpened. Not for hunting yet, but for readiness. The Vikings were not idle people. They waited with purpose. They moved through the thaw with patience. And in that waiting, they found strength. Strength not born of swords or shields, but of knowing that they had seen the worst and endured. Not alone, not in silence, but together. In breath, in firelight. In the hush between snowmelt and sunrise. When the rivers finally began to move again, it wasn't with a roar or rush, but with a slow, deliberate groan. Ice cracked like bones, shifting in ancient joints. Water peeked through the fractures, tentative and brown with winter's sediment. For the Vikings, this thaw was not just a sign of change, it was an invitation. An invitation to move, to travel, to reconnect with places and people that had been cut off for weeks, or even months. The longboats, stored under tarps and branches, were inspected by quiet hands. Their hulls, kissed by frost and time, were caressed and repaired, not in haste, in reverence. These boats were lifelines, carriers of trade, of exploration, of raids when the world allowed. But before any journeys began, the waters had to be listened to, watched. The elders knew the signs the way ice shifted at dusk, the rhythm of distant bird calls returning, the scent of cold mud waking beneath the banks. No one rushed, because the cold still had teeth. One wrong move, one misstep on thawing riverbanks, and the water would take you. Cold water. The kind that steals breath before you can even scream. The kind that wraps around ankles like iron. So they waited. And while they waited, they prepared. Clothing was mended again. Not for warmth this time, but for movement. Boots patched. Leather softened. Cloaks brushed clean of smoke and grease. The garments told stories for her traded years ago. A stitch made by a mother now long gone. A brooch passed down through frost-bitten fingers. Every item had been chosen not just for comfort, but for survival. The Vikings dressed for endurance, for wind that sliced from the mountains even in late light, for rain that didn't soak so much as chill to the core. And when movement began, when paths reopened and boats slid into awakening rivers, it wasn't a triumph. It was a breath. A long, slow exhale from a chest that had been tight for too long. Dogs barked differently. Horses stretched their legs, hooves clattering against still frozen soil, and people walked again. Not far at first, just to the neighboring farmstead, just to the edge of the woods, just enough to remember that the world was still there, that it hadn't disappeared beneath snow and silence. Along those paths, old markers were uncovered, stones worn smooth by generations, carvings barely visible, telling of births, of battles, of ancestors who had walked the same steps. These weren't monuments, they were reminders. That survival wasn't just about the body. It was about the place. The memory held in the land itself. Children were shown where berries would grow again, where traps might be set when the animals returned, where the ground would soften enough for planting. They were taught with soft voices, steady hands. No lectures, just demonstration. This is how you hold a blade. This is how you read the sky. This is how you listen to what the earth says without words. And through it all, the cold still waited, in shadows, in the breath that still curled in the air at morning. But it was no longer a master. It had been survived. And that survival was etched into every footstep, every calloused palm, every silent glance between people who had endured together. The thaw was not a victory march. It was a procession of remembering how to live fully again. With the thaw complete and the days beginning to stretch just a little longer, there came a change not only in the land, but in the rhythm of the people. It wasn't sudden. It was cautious, like an old song remembered slowly. The longhouses, once sealed tight against the cold, were now open to the air. Smoke still curled from their chimneys, but it mixed with the scent of wet earth, age, and returning moss. Inside, the hearths were still warm, but not roaring. They simmered now, sustaining rather than battling the cold. Women moved with quieter burdens, no longer hauling armfuls of wood, but instead weaving, carving, preparing. Men shifted from sharpening blades for defense to shaping tools for planting and trade. Children, once quiet in corners, returned to play, their laughter bouncing off walls that had heard only the hush of winter whispers. The village breathed differently. Not lighter, but steadier. With every warming day, tasks changed. The fishing lines were tested, nets unfurled and repaired with fingers still stiff from frost. The rivers were watched again, not just for passage, but for life. The first shimmer of scales beneath the water was a celebration, though no one danced or sang. In Viking life, joy was often silent. A nod, a shared glance. The quiet setting aside of a small portion of the catch for the gods or the spirits or simply for tomorrow. The gods were never far from their thoughts. Not just Odin, with his endless wisdom and sacrifice, or Thor, whose hammer called storms, but the quieter ones Tnurthus, who stirred the earth awake, or Skadi, who still watched from the snowy peaks with a hunter's eyes. Offerings were not elaborate. A piece of bread, a carved rune, a whispered word while kneeling in the mud. Gratitude was not about ceremony. It was about survival. Every returning bird, every blade of green, every loosened rock meant one more day, one more chance. The elders told stories again, not because winter had silenced them, but because spring gave those stories new meaning. Tales of journeys across the frozen sea, of wolves that followed too close, of ancestors who lit fires that never died, even when the wind howled through broken walls. These weren't lessons. They were bearings. They reminded the young who they came from, what it meant to endure not just with strength, but with patience. Outside, the world grew louder, but not harsh. The ice dripped rhythmically from branches. The soil sucked in water like thirst being quenched. Birds returned, tentative at first, then bold. And above it all, the sky widened. The stars didn't disappear, but they changed. The constellations that had marked the deep of winter gave way to new warning signs that it was time to move, to plant, to prepare for the cycle to begin again. Because in Viking life, nothing was ever truly over. Winter was not defeated. It was survived. And it would come again. But for now, there was warmth in the soil. There was light on the water. There was the sound of people living not in fear, but in rhythm with each other, with the land, with the memory of every long night they had faced and would face again. And in that rhythm, there was peace not loud, not fleeting, but deep. The kind that settles in your bones and stays there, quiet as the fire before sleep. Summer in the north never truly arrives as a triumphant banner of heat. Instead, it unfolds quietly, like the slow opening of a well-kept wooden chest, releasing fragrances of sap and peat, of distant seaweed drying on hidden coves. For the people who had held one another through the deepest dark, this gentler season was not a holiday, but a conversation with the land, a chance to answer winter's questions with work, gratitude, and careful planning. The fields thawed into soft furrows, and hands that had mended cloaks now pressed seeds into earth still cool from buried frost. Every kernel mattered. Every row was a promise delivered to the future hunger they knew would return. Down by the waterline, the longboats were eased from their resting cradles of timber and stone. Tar, dark as raven's feathers, was brewed from birch bark and brushed across the planks, sealing memory into wood grain. Storms survived, horizons found, friends lost to waves. Children were sent to gather smooth stones that would become ballast, while elders inspected the knotted rigging and felt along the grain of oars that must not splinter when the sea began to breathe harder. Yet even in the warmth, the Vikings could never forget the silent lessons of the cold. Leather boots were repaired with fresh sinew. Wool was spun thicker than the season required, because summer was not merely a present pleasure, it was a scaffold for the next descent into ice. Inside the longhouses, smoke thinned but never vanished. Small cooking fires still whispered beneath cauldrons, where early herbs swam with the last of the dried meat, teaching tongues what hope tasted like. At night, when dusk lingered in shades of blue that city dwellers will never know, the people gathered outside, placing stones in quiet circles to measure the sun's slow wheel. They spoke of voyages soon to begin south, perhaps, for amber and grain, or west, towards stories carried by gulls. Navigation was mapped not only on scraps of hide, but inside minds trained to read the slice of cloud against sun, the tilt of spray against hull, the hidden pulse of a magnet stone held to the light. And always, there was the law gathering the thing where free folk met on grassy plains to settle disputes, recite genealogies, and renew oaths beneath an open sky. Voices carried, steady and calm, because justice in the north was spoken aloud so that wind and gods could hear and remember. Between tasks, laughter returned in short, bright bursts, like birds released from cages. Children chased shadows across sun-warmed dirt, their feet bare, their memories of biting frost already softening into legend. Lovers found each other in the hush after chores, fingers tracing the scars of winter as if reading a shared runic text of survival. And when the longest day finally tipped past its golden edge, the village paused, sensing an old, familiar turning. Lanterns were lit earlier. Fishermen watched the color of the sea darken a shade, knowing the cycle was tilting back toward cold even as warm breezes still drifted through spruce branches. No one spoke of fear. They had learned that fear wasted heat. Instead, they planned. Nets were mended tighter, grain pits were dug deeper, stories were rehearsed so their edges would stay sharp when nights again grew long. Above them, the same constellations that had stared down on frozen roofs now shimmered in mild air. Silent witnesses to the truth every Viking carried in bone and breath, that summer was a guest, welcome but transient, and that the real art of living lay in greeting winter not as a conqueror, but as an old instructor returning to test what had been learned. So the people of the north smiled at the stars, banked their fires, and lay down on benches that creaked softly under new weight, letting sleep come like a slow tide, gentle, inevitable, and deeply known. As the light began to retreat earlier each day, the Viking world entered a quiet state of alertness. It was not panic, not even urgency, just a shift in rhythm that every living thing seemed to sense. Birds flew lower, as if the air itself thickened with the coming frost. Foxes padded closer to the edge of villages, not out of boldness but instinct. And within the homes of the north, hands moved faster over wool, over wood, over clay. Preparation was a sacred rhythm, and no one dared break it. Fires were rekindled, not because it was cold already, but because it would be. Bread was baked in larger batches, left to cool slowly beside carved windows where the draft had begun to whisper again. The wooden beams overhead, so solid in the heat of midsummer, now creaked with a language older than speech. A warning in every moan and groan that reminded the people. The freeze returns, always. The sea, once a highway of trade and raids, turned moody. Winds shifted, skies bruised. The longboats, honored and worn, were pulled farther inland. Ropes were tied not just to stakes, but to memories of storms that had once lifted vessels and slammed them against the earth like toys. Salt was scraped from stores and counted carefully, because salted meat was more than food, it was survival in muscle form. Animals sensed it too. Hens laid less. Goats grew restless. Pigs rooted deeper into straw. The youngest members of the village were taught anew how to close a door quickly, how to bank a fire, how to wrap a cloak tight against the wind that could, if disrespected, steal breath from lungs in seconds. In the longhouses, sleeping spaces were rearranged. Those closest to the hearth were given to the weak, the elderly, the pregnant. Others accepted the edges, curling together under layered hides, dreaming of hearthlight and thick soup. Even the smallest child knew that firewood wasn't just warmth, it was life. And so the forest thinned, respectfully. Only what was needed. Every log split was a day earned. Every pile stacked high was a prayer answered. Meals became more deliberate. The summer's bounty, dried and smoked, was rationed with silent care. Roots were buried in sand-filled jars. Barley was stored in tied cloth. Everything had a place, a purpose, and a consequence if wasted. And as the air bit sharper each morning, a kind of hush settled over the land. Conversations became murmurs. Footsteps softened. Even the dogs grew quieter, curling beside hearthstones as if afraid to bark away the precious heat. But it was not bleakness, not sorrow. The people of the north had learned to welcome this descent into frost, not with dread, but with reverence. Winter was not an enemy, was a mirror. It showed you who you really were. Had you prepared well enough? Had you honored the land? Had you listened to the elders, to the animals, to the sky? If so, the cold would not punish it, would simply arrive, test, and pass. And in the evenings, as stars pressed closer and frost painted the world silver, families gathered beneath low beams and thick roofs. They sang not for joy, but for continuity. Songs of ancestors, of sea beasts, of mountains that walked. Their voices rose not to fill the silence, but to harmonize with it. In those moments, Wrapped in wool, surrounded by kin, the Vikings did not feel small. They felt ancient, part of something vast and slow-moving. A people shaped not by conquest, but by survival. And so they sang, until sleep came, until dreams formed from steam and snow and the flicker of a dying flame. And so, as the deepest part of winter took hold, the world outside the Viking settlements became utterly still. Snow blanketed everything in a silence that was not just absence of sound, but a kind of reverent hush. Trees stood like statues, their limbs heavy with frost, and the rivers that once carried ships now slumbered beneath thick layers of ice. The longhouses, carved from timber and sealed with layers of sod, were no longer just homes, they were sanctuaries. Inside, the air was thick with a mingled sense of smoke, stew, pine pitch, and human closeness. Every crackle of the fire was a reassurance. Every breath that fogged in the cold air outside and disappeared reminded them of the cost of life. They didn't go out unless they had to. Even then, every step into the snow was deliberate. They moved like people entering a temple slowly, quietly, as if the world might punish too much haste. Fur-lined boots pressed down paths that had been carved over decades, and each bend in the snow-lined trail carried memories. Here was where someone fell through a crusted lake once. There was the hill where someone spotted a bear 2 winters ago. Memory kept them safe. Inside, stories flourished. With little light and long hours, the oral traditions that held their culture together became stronger than ever. Children sat wide-eyed while elders recounted tales of Odin wandering the earth in disguise, of wolves chasing the sun, of a tree so vast it held all the realms. But beneath the myths were lessons, quiet warnings about pride, greed, trust, endurance. These were not distractions from the cold. They were shields against it. They gave meaning to the waiting. They made the stillness feel like part of something larger, and the cold, it taught them rhythm. The body knew when to rise, when to sleep, when to conserve. They moved slower, ate slower, thought deeper. Eyes adjusted to dim light. Hands became more sensitive to the textures of wool, leather, wood. Crafting became meditation. A simple wooden spoon shaped by firelight and patience could take hours. A carved bone needle passed down through generations might be repaired and used again, its edges smoothed by decades of hands. Even the way they breathed changed. Inhale through the nose. Shallow. Quiet. Preserve the heat inside. Every act shown, no matter how small, became part of the sacred economy of survival. Waste nothing. Forget nothing. Ignore nothing. In the harshest weeks, when the wind howled like a thing alive and frost crept in even through sealed cracks, they leaned harder into community. No one was left alone. If someone had extra meat, it was shared. If one fire began to die, others contributed wood. Solitude was dangerous. Warmth was collective. And though death was always present hovering in the cold corners, waiting near the ill and the very old, it was not feared. It was acknowledged, spoken of, honored. The dead were remembered not with loud grief, but with gentle repetition. Their names were included in songs, their favorite carvings kept close, their tools repurposed, their wisdom echoed in decisions made by those who remained. Even the animals had a place in this remembrance. A dog who had kept watch for 12 winters, a goat who had once protected a child from a snake in the summer pasture. Their stories too were told. Because in this world, where cold could unmake anything, memory was the only immortality that mattered. And yet, despite it all, they laughed. Quietly, often. Not because life was easy, but because it was still theirs. Because the stew hadn't burned. Because someone's mittens had 2 different patterns. Because a baby giggled when it sneezed. These small sparks were how they lit the dark. They never expected warmth. They built it. They never waited for spring. They prepared for it. And in doing so, they made it through. One breath at a time, one story at a time, one fire at a time. Until, eventually, a morning would come when the wind shifted. Just a little. When the icicles began to drip. Slowly. when someone would squint at the pale sky and whisper, "It's turning," and hope that ancient ember buried beneath layers of snow and silence would glow again. By the time spring finally broke through the iron grip of the northern cold, the Vikings had already begun to stir. Not all at once, not with the drama of a thawing flood or sudden sunlight, but slowly like the earth itself, exhaling for the first time in months. The snow didn't melt in a day. It retreated inch by inch, revealing what it had buried. Stones, tools, bones, forgotten buckets, the twisted shapes of half-collapsed fences. But each patch of earth was a promise, a reminder. The world still lived beneath the weight of winter, and now it was waking. The men tested their boats again. The women gathered what supplies remained in the root cellars, counting them with practiced precision. The children, restless after months indoors, began running wild the moment the paths were clear, chasing each other with sticks and laughter, tumbling over into mud that only weeks ago would have killed them. But in the Viking world, survival didn't mean rest. It meant readiness. The worst was over, but the real work was beginning. The longhouses opened their doors wider now. Smoke no longer curled as thickly from the chimneys, and the smell of dried fish and salt pork was finally joined by something fresher herbs returning to the earth, and the faint aroma of pine needles drying under sun. Axes were checked, leather was mended, ropes were rebraided with steady fingers, because with the ice breaking up, the sea would call again soon. And with it, the rhythm of travel, of trade, of conquest. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold. They learned from it. It sharpened them. In the stillness of winter, they had gathered stories, honed skills, and memorized maps drawn into dirt with charcoal and stone. And now those plans would become movement. There was an understanding among them that life was seasonal, not just in weather, but in meaning. Winter was for inner strength. Spring was for rebuilding. Summer was for glory. Autumn for preparation. And it began again. This cycle wasn't written down. It was lived, felt, trusted. The old ones didn't need calendars. Their bones told them what season it was. Their instincts were as accurate as any sundial, and in this way, they endured. Even now, with the snow retreating and the streams flowing free, they remained cautious. One frost could still return. One careless moment could mean illness, broken limbs, or lost livestock. So they did not rush. They observed, listened. They spoke of signs the way birds returned, the shape of the moon, the color of the moss on the north side of stones. Everything meant something. Nothing was random. The return of spring also meant a return to ritual. Offerings were not grand or bloody, but sincere. A carved figurine placed near a stream. A song sung in the quietest voice toward the woods. A simple bowl of broth left near the roots of a tree. These were not just traditions. They were conversations with the unseen. The Vikings didn't need to know whether the gods answered. They just needed to know they had spoken. And so, the days grew longer. The animals gave birth again: goats, sheep, even dogs. New life filled the longhouses with noise and hope. And the people, weather-worn but unbroken, stepped into the light once more. They didn't boast about surviving. They didn't speak of winter as victory. They carried it with theme and scars, in stories, in the way they prepared firewood more carefully than before. Because to survive the coldest nights wasn't just about warmth, it was about memory. And memory, for the Vikings, was sacred. There were nights when the cold crept back, even in the heart of spring. It didn't knock or warn, it just seeped through the wood, lingered in the breath, curled beneath the furs and under the fingernails. The Vikings understood that survival didn't have a season. It was a constant state of mind, a readiness etched into muscle and memory. They didn't wait for comfort. They built resilience like a second skin. Even when the snow melted, the lessons of winter stayed buried in their bones. The elders spoke of winters past not as tragedies but as trials. Stories were passed down not for entertainment but instruction. A man who built his fire wrong and never woke up. A woman who trusted thin ice and vanished beneath it. A child who wandered off for a game and was found frozen, curled around a rabbit he tried to save. These were not just warnings, they were maps of how to live. Memory was survival. Pain was a teacher. And so, in every village, small acts of preparation continued. Extra tinder was kept dry in clay pots hidden behind stones. Boots were lined again with fur, even if the sun was out. The longhouses were patched not for beauty, but for wind resistance. Fish were salted and hung not because there was hunger, but because there would be. The Vikings never assumed the worst was over. They simply adjusted to whatever came next. Hunting returned with the thaw. Men tracked elk and bear, not just for meat, but for fat, for hide, for sinew. Every part of the animal had a use. The bones became needles, the tendons became thread, the hooves melted into glue. Waste was weakness, efficiency was sacred. And in the quiet of those early spring hunts, there was reverence. Not fear of nature, but partnership. A respect earned through centuries of coexisting with a land that never gave anything for free. In the forests, women foraged for wild greens, tender shoots, and bitter roots that helped cleanse the body after months of salted food. Children were taught what to eat and what to avoid. They learned not just by watching, but by touching, tasting, testing. A leaf could nourish or kill. A berry could bring fever or life. Knowledge wasn't academic, it was intimate. It lived in calluses and taste buds, in the hum of the bees returning to the hives built into cliffside cracks. At night, the rhythm of storytelling resumed around smaller fires. Not the great gatherings of midwinter, but quiet exchanges of father teaching his son how to read the stars, a mother explaining why the fox always comes before the thaw. These stories had no written pages, but they left deeper marks than ink ever could. They shaped decisions. They whispered when no one else was around. They said, "Remember what we've been through. Don't forget how we made it." And among them, there was no arrogance about endurance. They did not claim to conquer the cold. They said, "We lived through it." There was a difference. One boasted, the other respected. And that humility, that awareness of how small any man is against the vastness of wind and ice was the core of Viking strength. Not pride, perspective. So when the ships were pushed toward the river again, when the sails were checked for tears and the oars polished with fat and ash, it was done not with glee, but with gravity. They were not escaping the winter. They were carrying it with them. Each voyage, each raid, each trade journey was born from the lessons learned under frostbitten stars and howling skies. Every man on that boat knew how to keep his hands from freezing, how to find dry moss in a storm, how to sleep in shifts when the wolves circled. The cold didn't end. It just stepped back, and the Vikings stepped forward. When the fog rolled in thick and silent across the fjords, the Vikings did not see mystery or omen, they saw insulation. Fog muffled sound, slowed enemies, trapped warmth near the earth. They read the weather like scripture, not for prediction, but for understanding. Every shift in wind, every frost pattern on a shield, every creak of wood held meaning. To live through the cold was not a feat of strength, but of attention. You had to listen not with ears, but with your whole body. You had to feel when the ice was thinning under your boots, or when the air inside the longhouse changed its breath. The cold was not loud, but it always announced itself. Children learned the weight of survival early, not in lectures, but in chores. Fetch the wood, check the seals on the meat barrels, mind the goats for signs of illness. Every task was training. And yet, there was no panic, no dread. The Vikings met hardship with steadiness, with routine. Even when snow came early or the sun set far too soon, the rhythm of the day held. That rhythm was their anchor. Predictable, dependable, like the swing of an axe or the pull of an oar. It was how you stayed sane when the wind clawed at your door and the sky didn't rise for days. The longhouse, their sanctuary, was a lesson in warmth by design. Thick turf walls, low ceilings to trap heat, fire pits dug deep and banked with stones that held the heat long after the flames died. Beds were built close together not for comfort, but for shared warmth. Blankets layered with wool, fur, linen, and sometimes old sailcloth. The air was smoky, musky, and dense with breath, but it was life. And when one child woke shivering, Another would reach out without a word, pull them close. They didn't speak of love. They acted it. Water was melted snow, stored in stone jars kept by the hearth. Drinking it too quickly could chill the stomach, so it was taken in sips, warm from the fire. No one wasted anything. A burnt crust of bread was soaked in broth. A broken comb was shaved down into needles. Every scrap held value. Not because they were poor, but because they were wise. To waste in a land like theirs was to tempt death. Frugality wasn't just survival, it was honor. Outside, the animals fared differently. Chickens and goats were brought indoors during the worst of the storms, penned in corn, RS near the people. Their heat helped. Their presence reminded the children that all life was connected in that closed space. The dogs curled by the door, ears twitching at every sound. Not just companions, but early warning systems. If a wolf came close, or if a stranger approached through the white silence, the dogs knew first. And the Vikings trusted them. Clothing was layered in wisdom. Not just fur and wool, but how it was worn. Long tunics with underlayers. Cloaks lined with sheepskin and pinned with bone or bronze. Leather thongs wrapped around wrists and ankles to seal out the wind. The women often knew the best stitches to use where the cold bit hardest the underarms, the neck, the calves. And if a man tore his boots, he didn't take them to a merchant. He took them to his sister or mother. Survival was communal. Skill was shared. At night, the songs returned. Low and long like waves under ice. Not always joyful, not always sad. Just steady. A way to mark time. A way to remind the mind of warmth when the skin forgot. These songs were passed like heirlooms, each note etched with memory. A mother singing to her child as she stitched another patch on a worn cloak. A man humming while carving runes into a new spear. The melodies were simple, but the meanings were deep about hunger endured, about light returning, about gods who watched but did not always answer. The gods, too, were shaped by the cold. Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom, was the patron not of comfort but of endurance. Thor, who brought thunder, also brought firewood and protection. Freya, fierce and gentle, was prayed to not just for love, but for fertility of soil and survival of kin. Their myths weren't distant, they were embedded in frost, in the bark of trees, in the crackling of bones beside a dying fire. And through it all, the Vikings did not curse the cold, they accepted it. They spoke of it with respect, as if it were an old friend with a cruel sense of humor, one that tested you but never lied. The cold never pretended to be kind, and in that honesty, there was a strange kind of comfort. You knew where you stood. You knew what was required. You endured not to prove strength but to be worthy of the stories your children would one day tell. Because in a world of snow and silence, the most lasting warmth came not from fire, but from memory. Before the snow even touched the ground, the Vikings were already preparing. Not because they feared the cold, but because they knew it. They recognized the shift in the wind's voice, the subtle tightening of the soil beneath their boots, the way the birds disappeared not in panic, but in rhythm. Autumn was not an end, it was a signal. The drying racks filled with fish turned stiff like boards. The smokehouses thickened with meat-laden air. Birch bark was peeled, dried, and set aside to help kindle fires through months when the world outside would try to kill them slowly. The cold in the Viking world was not cinematic. It was not a blizzard that arrived all at once. It was a slow, creeping thing. A thief that stole a little more each night, first the grass, then the color from the trees, then the hours of daylight. And the Vikings did not fight it, they outlasted it. Their longhouses became the center of the universe. Fire pits, positioned not in the corner but in the center of the home, served as a heart-pulsing heat into the bones of those who gathered around it. Stones were arranged around the pit to absorb warmth and release it gently over the night. But it wasn't just warmth they needed, it was light. Oil lamps were carved from soapstone or pottery, their flames small but persistent. They lined the walls like stars in a man-made sky. Children would stare at them, eyes wide, tracing the shapes of shadows on timber walls. Old women told stories in those hours, not because they were bored, but because memory was a blanket. To remember was to warm the soul. They spoke of times when the wolves came too close, when the ice broke under the sled, and a man vanished without a splash. But they also told tales of return of spring, of survival, of seed hidden deep in frozen soil. Fur was not worn for decoration. It was armor against the unseen. Reindeer pelts, thick and oiled, lined the insides of boots. Wolf fur wrapped around the shoulders of warriors, not just for pride, but because wolves knew the cold better than men ever would. They studied animals not just to hunt them, but to learn from them. How to curl when the wind screamed. How to dig into snow for shelter. How to wait without wasting energy. The outside world became a different planet. Trees no longer looked like trees. Their branches bent low with white burden creaking like ships in a storm. The sky was not blue, but a muted silver, heavy with clouds that refused to speak. Sound behaved differently. It didn't echo, it absorbed. A man could scream in a snowstorm and hear only his own breath in his fur hood. This silence was both peaceful and dang. The cold could make you forget what day it was. It could blur time. But life continued. The hearth still needed care. The goats still needed food. Snow wasn't just swept from the path, it had to be cleared from the roof to keep it safe. The younger ones helped the older ones knock icicles from the eaves before they became heavy. Tasks weren't based on age, but on reliability. A 10-year-old who paid attention might be trusted more than someone twice their age who didn't. Everyone contributed. Doing nothing wasn't an option not out of pride, but because it simply wasn't safe. People carved simple patterns into firewood to stay occupied. They braided cords until their hands ached. They repaired sleds and sharpened tools. Every hour had a task. Inside the longhouse, time flowed differently. It had its own rhythm. There was laughter gentle and quiet, not loud or sharp. It lived within the walls like warmth. The elders sat closest to the fire not for recognition, but because they needed it. Their bones remembered every season. The youngest sat near the door, away from the fire. It was how they learned, how they listened for movement outside. Even where someone sat had meaning. Who passed you a bowl? Who lit your lamp? And when the wind shifted, when a soft breeze rolled in from the coast or stars peeked through the clouds, people stepped outside. Just to breathe. Just to feel the open air. Sometimes they said nothing. Sometimes they whispered small wishes. But all of them understood something deeper. The cold wasn't an enemy. It was part of the land, part of their days. They moved through it not by resisting, but by keeping pace with it. The sun would return. Not by chance, but because it always did. The coldest nights never arrived with warning. They came quietly, pressing in with silence. On those nights, frost didn't just appear on windowsills, it seemed to grow from within them, spreading delicate shapes across the glass. These were the nights when even the boldest among them paused before stepping outside. Every breath came slow. Every step was planned. The air itself felt still, almost like it was holding its breath. Inside, the longhouse became everything. It was warmth. It was light. It was the sound of logs shifting in the fire. Heavy blankets, made of stitched hides, smelled of smoke and wood. They weren't decorative, they were essential. Food, though carefully stored, needed to be prepared close to the flames. Frozen cuts were warmed before cooking. Grains became thick stews that filled the body. Dried fish was softened in warm broth. Eating wasn't just routine, it became grounding. The cold outside made simple meals feel meaningful. But survival wasn't only physical. It was emotional too. On these nights, they turned to what they knew best: stories, songs, traditions. They shared old tales, not just to pass the time, but to hold on to something steady. There were stories of winter spirits walking distant paths, only seen by those with deep understanding. Tales of guiding lights in the sky sent to remind people they were not forgotten. The children listened with wide eyes, unsure where imagination ended and truth began. And there were songs. Low, steady melodies, more felt than heard. They hummed them in rhythm with the fire's crackle. Soft, steady sounds that brought comfort when the wind howled outside. Melodies older than memory, passed down not with notation but through lips and lungs. Songs that didn't ask the cold to go away, but songs that acknowledged it, welcomed it even. The Vikings knew that to fear the cold was to give it power. But to name it, to sing to it, to endure it together, that was how you survived. Outside, the snow buried everything in silence. Tools left out became fossils by morning. Steps made in the night vanished by dawn. It was easy to believe in the darkest hours that the world had stopped turning, that the gods had turned their backs, but then a rooster would cry, a child would stir, a flame would be coaxed back to life from smoldering ash. And just like that, the cycle resumed. They took turns keeping watch at night, not for invaders, but for collapse. A roof beam weakened by ice, a fire that died too soon, a child coughing in their sleep. The watchers walked the length of the longhouse in silence, wrapped in furs, feet barely making a sound on the packed earth floor. They did not speak unless necessary. Their presence was comfort enough. Some nights the aurora would appear, green and violet curtains of light unfurling in the sky, silent and otherworldly. The doors would be open just enough to see, and the household would gather briefly, breathlessly, to witness it. No one spoke. No one moved. It was not just beautiful. It was sacred. Proof that even in the deepest cold, the skies still danced, that the world beyond their little wooden walls still remembered them. They did not wish for spring. Wishing was for those who had no plan. The Vikings did not hope, they prepared. Every act, every breath, was part of a design meant to see them through to the thaw. They sharpened their axes not because they expected battle, but because a blunt blade was a dead man's tool. They repaired their sleds not because they wanted to travel, but because they might have to. And when, eventually, the snow began to soften, when the ice on the roof cracked and dripped, and the earth began to smell of mud instead of silence, they did not cheer. They nodded. They moved slowly, like people waking from a long sleep. The cold had not broken them, and that was enough. The final weeks of winter in the Viking world were not triumphant. They were cautious. The cold no longer bit quite so deep, but its shadow still lingered. It was in the creak of melting ice, in the way the earth remained hard beneath the softened snow, and in the eyes of those who had seen too many winters to trust the early warmth. They moved with care, with reverence, as though the season itself might punish their eagerness. Inside the longhouse, the air began to shift. Smoke from the hearth no longer clung as stubbornly to the beams. The fire still burned, but it didn't need to rage. Children played nearer the door, emboldened by hints of sunlight that crept through the cracks. The elders watched, remembering the silence that had filled these same walls only weeks before. Life did not return all at once, it thawed, like the ice on the roof, slow and dripping. They began to unseal their stores. Baskets of roots, carefully buried in earth-lined pits, were unearthed and checked for rot. Meats that had been preserved in salt and smoke were inspected, sliced, and shared sparingly. No one feasted. Feasts were for later, for planting time, for raiding season, for weddings and births. Now was a time of ration and reflection. Survival wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to learn from. Tools were brought out of hiding, inspected, oiled. Leather was softened by hand and heat, not because it was urgent, but because that's how the cycle continued. The rhythm of Viking life was one of preparation, endurance, and adaptation. There were no shortcuts. Every scar in the wood of the shield, every nick on a blade, told a story not just of battle, but of weather, of seasons survived. In the still cold mornings, they began to venture outside, not far just to check the traps, to see if the river's edge had begun to crack and run. Footsteps were careful, deliberate. Paths had to be relearned, trees recounted, landmarks remapped. Snow could hide 1,000 changes, and when it melted, what was left might not resemble what had been buried. But the people knew the signs. A certain bird call, the taste of air in the early dawn, the way the dogs sniffed the wind and wagged their tails with a little more life. These things mattered more than calendars. The sun was watched not with curiosity, but with calculation. Its arc determined planting, sailing, hunting. It was a god in motion, not a ball of fire. They didn't just observe it, they read it. And slowly, the community began to open. Neighbors who had seen no one for months arrived at the longhouse bearing gifts, newly carved bowls, smoked meat, a repaired tool. Not out of charity, but out of balance, winter isolated them. Spring reminded them they were not alone. Stories were exchanged. Not all of them were true, but all of them were needed. They spoke of dream-suff ancestors visiting in the night, of wolves whose howls carried messages, of gods who passed unseen through the smoke. These dreams weren't dismissed. They were interpreted. The long months of darkness were not empty. They were full of visions, and now, in the thaw, those visions had to be understood. Cleansing followed, not in the way we think of spring cleaning, but ritualistically. The hearth was swept with bundles of dried herbs. Ashes from the winter's last fire were buried at the edge of the homestead. Water, drawn fresh from the first melt, was sprinkled on the lintels and thresholds. The Vikings knew that the cold was not just an enemy. It was a spirit, one that had visited them, one that needed to be respectfully dismissed. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. Sheep that had huddled for warmth now wandered in stiff-legged curiosity. Chickens scratched cautiously at frozen earth. Dogs, leaner but alert, patrolled the edges of the farmstead, ears twitching at sounds long forgotten. And as the first true thaw arrived, when the river cracked open like a wound and ran fast with the snow's surrender, the Vikings stood by it in silence. They did not cheer. They did not weep. They filled their buckets. They touched the water to their lips. They looked at one another, nodding once, maybe twice. They had made it through another winter. No one said it, but all felt it. Survival was not just the absence of death. It was the practice of living with intention. It was preparing, enduring, reflecting, and beginning again. The cold had shaped them, but it had not claimed them. And now, with the thaw, they would start once more, building, planting, voyaging, not because they were fearless, but because they were ready.